Good afternoon. I'm Enzo Mozano, and I've been asked by the organizers to introduce Giuseppe Caire, the next keynote speaker. Thank you very much for this honor. So I have known Giuseppe for many years, and when I think about him, the term that comes to mind is wideband, or maybe even ultra-wideband, because he has a broader command and understanding of wireless communications than anybody I know. So he could be discussing some deep information theoretic aspect with somebody involving nitty-gritty mutual information, and then just turn around and start talking with somebody else about, say, synchronization or any other practical issue. And recently even about standardization and the business value of specific techniques. And of course he can discuss anything else in between these extremes, say channel estimation, power control, coding, interference management, MIMO, massive MIMO, and you name it. So on all these problems, he's made important, sometimes fundamental contributions. So he has an amazing bandwidth. And for those of us who live and work in Europe, there's now a reason to celebrate, because after a few years of exile in the US, he's back amongst us, settled in Germany as of a few months ago. So he's an asset that we're going to have. And so let me say, Giuseppe, on behalf of European wireless research community, that it's good to have you back. And today he's going to talk about an idea that's getting momentum, and that's, in a sense, a very good complement to what Shlomo covered this morning. So Shlomo told us about the benefits of centralizing the baseband processing at the core. And Giuseppe is going to sing the virtues of keeping the data stored at the edges. So these are two powerful ideas, perhaps even conflicting ideas, I don't know. Maybe you'll touch on that. But definitely two powerful ideas and disruptive, which is what ones like to see in a keynote presentation. So let's hear about it. Please help me welcome Professor Giuseppe Caire.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's great. This is the typical example of a good trade-off between a very attractive place to be, so people come, and you know, maybe not too attractive, so people stay in the session. I see. That's fantastic. About the best. Okay, so this is a very kind of high-level overview of a topic that, as Angel just said, is really gaining momentum. And the idea is that people realize that sometimes layering and letting computer science software people deal with the application layer as if the physical layer and the network layer didn't exist, and letting the standard people go down to the air interface and somehow do not take into account that data have very different natures and that could be exploited is not the best thing to do. So these cross-layer design ideas have been going on for a long time, but here we are trying to take a different approach. You can see, in a very broad sense, this as a sort of cross-layer design, because of course, content stays at the application layer, and transmission and spectral efficiency stays at the physical layer, and there is a lot of things in between. But this is more on the network architecture. So it's looking at a different network architecture for a certain type of killer applications that, as we will see, have a big impact in this sort of spectrum crunch that people are saying we are experiencing. And at the same time, it's also very interesting to see that this type of approach gives origin to a new set of problems that are a little bit different from the classical setting of information theoretic problems. So there is also some interesting theory to develop. And I should mention that this is in particular joint work with my students and colleagues at USC, and of course with Dr. Antonia Tulino and Jaime Yorca at Bell Labs. Okay, so this picture is what keeps us in business. because it's the prediction that essentially data demands keep growing almost at an exponential rate. And in particular, as you can see, mobile video and mobile web data plays a big role. Altogether, count for like over 85% of the wireless traffic today. At the same time, this is also a picture that is really frightening for wireless operators, is that, well, at the introduction of flat rate data plans, revenues keep being leveled and grow very slowly, while data demand goes very quickly. So essentially, people do not know how to make money anymore out of wireless, because you cannot keep charging by the byte, because we keep now consuming more and more and more gigabytes every month. So this would be totally infeasible. At the same time, so the only alternative is to make networks cheaper to operate. Dramatically cheaper. The cost per bit must go dramatically down. Okay, so what is the standard answer to this problem? Is denser spatial reuse. Denser spatial reuse means somehow make the infrastructure more and more dense. This is a nice picture that I took from a presentation of Jeff Andrews that shows that if you look at the 50s to today and look at the contribution that more spectrum going to better like frequency division, allocation, all this dynamic spectrum, blah, 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 cognitive radio. I have total respect for those problems, but, and of course, all the standardizations, successive generations going from GMSK to 8PSK to OFDM, big QAM constellations, all MIMO. I mean, all this stuff that we love so much counts for like a very small factor, and just making the infrastructure denser counts for like orders of magnitude more. And this is very easy to understand, right? You shrink by a certain factor the distance between base stations, and then your density goes up quadratically with this factor, and you just reuse the spectrum more and more. So it's very easy. You take a factor of 10 in distance, you get a factor of 100 in spectral efficiency, area spectral efficiency. Okay? So we also know that there is a fundamental law on transport capacity, which means that if we have to move a bit by a long distance, well, this is difficult. We have like a fundamental bound that says that we cannot fit too many links. The capacity per link, when the distance is essentially of the size of the linear size of the network, goes to 0 as one over square root of the number of connections. But of course, if we let the distance to go also to shrink as 1 over square root of n, which means essentially we keep increasing the density and therefore make the distance between the content and the destination shorter, we can keep this per link throughput constant. Okay? So that's the idea. We need to bring the content closer to the users, which means, it would be nice to have a little base station every 10 meters connected to a fantastic fiber optical backhaul that somehow, as soon as you browse the internet and you request some content, is already at a few meters from you. You get it from a very high frequency link with a large bandwidth and do not interfere with anybody else, and everybody's happy. So what is the problem with this solution? Of course, the problem is backhaul bottleneck. As we learned from Shlomo's talk this morning, well, the backhaul can be improved. The techniques, very sophisticated compression, front haul. Now, what is backhaul? What is front haul? Here, I'm more concerned about backhaul, really moving the data around. Front haul is more like moving the signals from the antenna heads to the central processor, but somehow, say, at a high level, they somehow look the same. You have a very high rate fiber optical network, and you want to connect all these little base stations or antenna heads as much as you can. And of course, this costs a lot of money. There are some countries that have wired, and you have fiber optics sockets in every apartment, and then they have no problems. But go to the United States. Until 2 months ago, my connection in a very wealthy and fancy area of Los Angeles didn't go more than 5 megabit per second. And this was the socket. Of course, I had the wireless. I had 50 megabit per second in the home, but I had 5 in the socket, okay? And this is the backhaul today in LA, which is not precisely an underdeveloped place when you think about it, okay? Good, so we have this problem of backhaul. So then we look at the applications, and we see that, well, as I said, video, on-demand video streaming is responsible for a very large chunk of this data demand increase. The other big chunk is internet browsing. And what these two types of traffic have in common is that they are characterized by a lot of redundancy that we call, I and my co-authors call, asynchronous content reuse. Content reuse means that the same content is used over and over. And people like to watch the popular episode of the most recent TV show, the 2 or 3 titles that appear on Netflix or on Amazon Prime every 2 weeks or every month. And somehow these demands concentrate there. Asynchronous because people like to watch these things or to access to these things when they want. The paradigm of sitting at, I don't know, 7 p.m. in front of the TV and watching the news doesn't exist anymore. This is what old-fashioned paradigm. Now people, you have, you know, my son is streaming a YouTube video in his room, and I am doing email in my room, and my wife, I don't know, is doing something else in the living room. So this doesn't. Maybe we have a dysfunctional family, so I am not saying that this should be, but this is a matter of fact. This is what happens. People like to see things when they want and not when the TV station wants. So live streaming may have you know, some interest for very, very big live events like the Olympic Games or the Soccer World Cup. But in general, the live streaming where everybody sees the same thing at the same time does not exist anymore. And it's certainly not the killer application for internet traffic. And therefore, we will not talk about that because, you know, there is a lot of, you know, multicast protocols, and you can, in wireless, you can take advantage of, you know, broadcasting over the air. So a single transmission satisfies many people, and this is done today. I mean, digital TV, satellite TV, it works in this way. So here we are concerned with asynchronous content reuse. And the problem is, how do we exploit this enormous redundancy inherent in these demands, although they do not happen at the same time? So what does it mean they do not happen at the same time? It means that the time asynchronicity of the demands is of the same order or bigger than the duration of the session. I watch a movie now, and you watch the same movie in 2 hours from now. So my transmission is totally useless for you. And today, systems, I mean, the physical layer or the network layer treats this as independent data. So I open my TCP IP connection and I use, say, Dash to stream my video, and then you do the same thing in 2 hours. It's the same exactly data, but of course, it's treated as independent. So you are using exactly the same bandwidth another time, okay? So this is the type of redundancy that we want to eliminate. Okay, so this has been understood very well to a certain extent in wired networks, because we know, Akamai and this type of companies, they do content distribution networks, which is essentially replication trees, such that eventually every user accessed content which has been replicated to local servers, such that you make a request to the big server, I don't know, somewhere in some big data center, but then this is redirected and you start streaming from the local server, okay? And this is caching in wired networks. So why this doesn't really work so well in wireless, so why we still have some problems? The problem is that in wireless, between the core network where these, say, the Akamai servers live and the users. Here is Steve Jobs, which is a typical example of somebody who is a very good computer scientist that has always given the physical layer and the network layer for granted. So you go to the retina display, 4K, the fantastic application at the application layer, but when you don't have something that delivers your data below, all these nice things like iTunes collapse. It was very, very illuminating for me when I bought my first Apple TV a few years ago in Los Angeles, and I said, okay, now we're going to watch a movie. So I selected high definition, and the prefetching time was 2 hours. So essentially longer than the duration of the movie, okay? And then I said, okay, this must be wrong. Okay? And this is because these guys, like Steve Jobs, do not understand transmission, do not understand what happens in between their application and my device. And this is very typical. Okay, so we have these, right? We have like a lousy copper line. We have a lousy, I don't know, Wi-Fi that interfere with your neighbors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is that you want to move this caching here. You want to move it here. Okay, so the idea is that we have an enormous distributed caching capacity, or storage capacity. Imagine like 5 billion of wireless devices times 64 gigabytes of memory, which is roughly, say, in a couple of years, is going to be the average. This would be 32 in 10 to the 19th byte of storage capacity in the world. I think it's a pretty large number. I don't know if it is a exabyte, petabytes, or whatever, thousands of petabytes. So storage capacity is enormous. The other interesting feature is that storage capacity, if you store in the user devices, when you have more users, you have more devices, because we all have some between 16 and 64 gigabytes in our pocket today. I think all of you have one, right? And we are, what, 200 people in this room? So in this room, as we speak, we have something like, it's about, let's say on average, 32 gigabytes per square meter, roughly speaking. So even if we originate many demands, automatically we have an enormous storage capacity here, not somewhere else. Because where the users are, also the memory is. Okay? And the other thing is that, well, we can use, a nice use of the cellular infrastructure is to essentially fill up caches at off-peak times. Most of the towers sit there at night doing nothing. Why they just can be used to refresh caches. So you need a network that learns what the user like and fill them up, right, at off-peak times at a very low cost. So we go to the problem of placement and delivery. Placement is, let me say, okay, we have many questions, right? The question is what to cache. So how do we know what users like? Cache placement is how to set up the caches. What do you store? You store entire files, you store packets, you store linear combinations, you store network-coded information, who knows? Streaming is how you organize sequences of packets such that all together makes a long movie. So it's more about scheduling and resource allocation. Delivery is once you have all this sequence of packets, how you actually deliver them. Like you deliver them just as they are, or you encode them in some way, you take advantage of multiple requests at the same time. And then, of course, transmission. Transmission goes at the physical layer, and the transmission is more or less what we know best, right? We use MIMO, we use small cells, we use all the technology that we can do at the wireless level. Okay, here I'll be essentially concerned with these two problems, cache placement and delivery. Streaming is somehow related to scheduling. This is physical layer, we know how to do it. And this is a more like far-fetching, is how much of the user distribution of demands we can actually learn and predict. And this is a very nice problem that I would like to work myself, but I think it pertains more to the big data machine learning area and less to the information theory and networking area. Anyway, so the other thing that I would like to stress is that there is a sort of time scale decomposition across these problems. You have the evolution of the user demands. For example, the demand distribution that evolves probably at a time scale of the order of days. Now, every week you have new TV episodes for your favorite series. You have new movies in a library that are offered, and of course you take out the outdated information like old news. Every morning you have the morning news, the opening of the stock exchange, etc., etc. And these things are also intuitively, although I do not have any precise statement, I don't know if anybody has a precise statement on that, they look like cyclostationary to me, because humans are very cyclostationary. You do more or less the same thing at every time of the day. Wake up, have breakfast, read the newspaper, read email, go to work, have lunch, more or less the same time, more or less the same place. So we are like cyclostationary beings, which means that these can be predicted, although I don't know how to do it. Let's assume we know. So let's assume that there is a known demand distribution that evolves very slowly. Then we have, the video time scale is maybe, I don't know, something that between, say, 30 minutes and 1 hour. If we talk about movies, maybe shorter if we talk about YouTube videos. Now, a video is made of a lot of group of pictures or video chunks. Those are maybe 2 to 4 seconds of encoded video. When you look at, say, a 4K or maybe even a high-definition video, this is a lot of bits, really a lot of bits. You don't fit video chunks in a single physical layer packets. Actually, you need probably hundreds of physical layer packets to deliver a video chunk. And so we have this sort of very clear separation. It's the thing that happens here somehow must be instructed to the packet sequence and the quality level at which you are downloading your video. But clearly, I mean, every video chunk is mapped into many little slots at the Wi-Fi or LTE level. So this means that we can attack these problems a little bit separately, but somehow trying to optimize a whole thing. So the general problem setup now I'm taking a more restricted view. Okay, so there is let me stress the following. In classical communication and information theory, we have sources with messages, and they're given to you, and then we have destinations that want messages, and they are also given to you. They define, together with the network topology, they define the problem. Think about, for example, the broadcast channel. You have one transmitter with all the messages, the users, each one has his own request, if we are talking about individual messages, and this is clear. This guy has the messages, this guy has the request, we know which guys want which message, and then the problem is to transmit them as efficiently as possible, right? Here, in a caching network problem, we have let's say a library of possible messages, but we can place them. Nodes do not have by nature those messages. Nodes have capacity constraints, say memory constraints. So you can place these messages as long as you don't violate these memory constraints into the nodes in the way you want. However, the demands are not known a priori. You don't know that user 1 wants message 1 and user 2 wants message 2. User 1 may pick any of these messages, or maybe in a probabilistic way, may flip a coin and pick a message at random according to some demand distribution. And this is not known a priori. So the design of the code is like in information theory. You first generate the codes, then you reveal the codes to everybody, and then you use them forever. And then you measure the rate. The generation of the codes and the revelation of the codes to the nodes is not part of the communication. It's not counted as overhead in the counting of rate, because anyway it would take a negligible amount of time with respect to using those forever, right? Now, here part of the code generation is also how you place the messages in the caches. Okay, this is part of the code. And then the demands are random or arbitrary. Anyway, the demands will, you may imagine that the user will keep demanding these messages, and you will, the system will keep essentially satisfying those requests forever, and then you measure the rate. Okay? So somehow you have to place the messages a priori in a way that is good for any set of demands, or in the average case, is a good on average for a random demands. Okay? So we are essentially in this, let's take the broadcast channel. This is the classical broadcast channel with independent messages, one transmitter, 3 messages, A, B, C. User 1 wants A, user 2 wants B, user 3 wants C, and everything knows. Now, if we have caches and we can place these messages, well, if you know a priori that this guy wants A, well, you will probably put here a lot of A. If the cache is bigger than the message, you just put it here, and then you don't have to communicate anymore. But this is too easy. It's too easy because it's like cheating, right? You know already that this guy wants to use a message A, so you just give it to him a priori. So then we are in this situation. We have memory, so caches, but we don't know what these users want. These users may pick any ABC, these users may pick any ABC, and then we have different cases, right? We have the case of arbitrary demands, where you typically pose the problem as a compound, and then you look for the worst case congestion for the worst case demands. Or you may consider the case of random demands, for which you want to optimize an average measure of congestion, of requested rate. And maybe you may even allow for some outage probability. And here I'm saying that a user is in outage if its demand cannot be satisfied, is not satisfied by the code. Okay? So we are in this situation, and now I'm going to just briefly go through a bunch of recent results. So there is a well-known and somehow studied problem in say, computer science and network coding, which is called the data placement problem, where the idea is to jointly optimize placement of data. This has to be done a priori. And at the same time, also the network topology, so the routing strategy, in order to minimize some kind of cost, which could be worst case cost for arbitrary demands or average cost for random demands. So for example, this problem was studied here. Is known to be, in general, a hard problem. It's an NP hard and exponentially hard to approximate, etc., etc. So people have looked at special cases. Then a set of more recent works by my co-workers, Jaime Yorca and Antonio Tullino and others have shown that, in fact, when you allow network coding, it's not just routing, but you allow network coding, so you allow to essentially send coded information around, then this data placement problem can be solved in polynomial time over in a special case, in this case where all the demands, every user wants everything, so it is the multicast case, on a graph that is called the demand augmented graph, is a graph that you make with all the packets that are requested by different users. Unfortunately, this graph grows, so the exponential complexity goes from the solution of the problem to the number of constraints or nodes in the graph. And they also show that in the general case, the problem is again, and also with coding, is NP hard. So this problem is very tough. So when you have a tough problem, typically you look at sub-problems, which means restrict the scope and restrict the possible topologies. And here is a set of recent works that have looked at different angles on this type of problem. So this is a work by myself with Andy Molish and our student Mingwei Ji. We have looked at a network with device-to-device links. So it's a wireless network where nodes or users are able to communicate directly under a protocol model. So it's a very simple collision avoidance model for which if a receiver has a transmitter in a certain radius, is not able to receive its packet because you have a collision. So it's the same collision model that Gupta and Kumar use for their scaling law. And we consider decentralized random caching. So users cache at random according to a distribution that we can optimize, and make demands at random, IID, according to a distribution that we assume to be known. What we showed is that the throughput of this system for any fixed desired probability of outage, so we allow for a non-zero outage probability, but also non-one. So there is like we say, for example, 5% of the users are not satisfied. Okay, you allow for that. And then the throughput scales as the maximum of these two terms. Is 1 over n. N is the number of users. 1 over n means simply that every user, well, we just send one file each, right? So it's 1 over n. It's TDMA. The other number is more interesting. Big M is the size of the caches, and small m is the size of the library. So the cache size is normalized in number of files, and the library is also number of files. So this ratio is the number of equivalent files you can cache locally over the number of total files in your library. Okay? And the interesting thing is that when in the interesting regime where the product of the total memory in the system, which is the product of big M times number of users, is much larger than the number of files. So we have a lot of memory. We have a lot of redundancy in caching these files. This throughput, this, by the way, is worst case throughput per connection. It's not some throughput. Scales linearly with the memory size, which means that we effectively are turning silicon, so the Moore's law, into bandwidth. You double your memory in all the devices, say in 2 years, no, we double our memory, and you have doubled your throughput without using larger spectrum, without using more power, nothing. MIMO, nothing. It's just simple point-to-point links. Okay? Now, for a different problem setup, Madali and Niesen, also Bell Labs, have shown, I will go through this result because it's very nice, that, well, the problem looks completely different. This is arbitrary demands, worst case throughput, zero outage because they design codes that satisfied by design all the demands. You get exactly the same scaling law. Okay? And then we said, okay, so maybe we can put these things together, right? Intuitively, this result is due to spatial reuse. You have a lot of concurrent local links because you have a certain, with high probability you're going to find your content in a user close to you. This result is due to a completely different principle. This is just a one transmitter, many users, and since the transmitter have this cache, the content of the cache can act as side information, which means that the transmitter, even though you have asynchronous and different demands, the transmitter can send just a single network-coded code word, multicast this code word to everybody, and everybody get their content because with this, say, linear combination of packets, plus the packets they have cached locally, they can decode what they want. Okay? So this result is due to multicasting gain. Okay? Coded multicasting gain. So we thought that maybe we can put these things together and consider a D2D network with the spatial reuse, but a nice coded caching system that take advantage of this multicasting gain. Well, it turns out that at least for this achievability scheme, we don't have the converse for this result, but if you just put these things together, you don't get a better scaling law. You may get a better constant in front of the scaling law, but you don't get a better scaling law. And I will comment about this, because when my student came up with this and I said, okay, you must have forgotten something, right? Because normally you have a good thing, you put it together with another good thing, and then you should see some improvement. And here, it turns out that there is like a cancellation effect. There are two different trends that compensate each other. So The scaling law does not improve. Let me comment about this later. So, okay. So then, of course, there is a lot of more recent works that have looked at different variation on the theme, more complicated networks like two-level hierarchy of caches, the case of non-uniform demand, so random demand distribution with the coded scheme. We have some work that does similar related to this with stronger results about optimality. Together with Alex Dimakis and a student, we'll look at the problem where you have, let's say, local caches that are not directly in the user memory, but they are, for example, in access points that you can access at a very high rate, and they're common. So, for example, here, imagine that there is a time capsule with, I don't know, 4 terabytes here of cache stuff, and now we have all independent demands, but you all have a very fast link to this local cache, and you can receive something from the base station. So in this case, well, we designed some index. This is index coding with local shared site information, and we have some polynomial algorithms that somehow break the exponential complexity of index coding, etc., etc. I mean, if you look now for caching in networks, and there are like probably, I don't know, hundreds of papers. So it's a very alive and interesting set of problems. So let me comment something I have already said, Moore's law for bandwidth. That's a very nice selling point for operators. Say, you can double your capacity by putting more memory in your phones instead of putting more base stations, and this costs much less. As I said, these can be achieved with the spatial reuse, or this network-coded multicasting gain. I'll be much more specific on these two because these are, in a certain sense, the best understood results. So I'll get into the details here. As I said, when the bad news is that when the the library size is much larger than the collective memory of all the users, there is nothing to gain. Essentially, TDMA is treating these messages as individual independent information is, in terms of scaling law, is the best you can do. And this is also intuitive, right? Because this means that there is no asynchronous content reuse. There is no redundancy to squeeze. If you have a library of a billion of files and you have 100 users and they all pick files there, like say the YouTube paradigm, then it's very hard. On the other hand, if you have, for example, if you are Netflix and you want to become a wireless Netflix, this is effective because Netflix has, right now, maybe has like 3,000 titles, but practically they have 50 titles that people watch. The rest is things that are completely unwatchable and nobody cares. So if they would just concentrate on their first 50 titles and refresh these every week and put a new interesting movie every week, people will be very happy. And then you have 50 movies, and then we are in business because in this room we will have this library cached several times, and then you can, if it is not on your phone, you get it from your neighbor. Okay, so the other thing that I was saying is that yes, spatial multiplexing and coded multicasting do not cumulate, and there is tension between these two. I will comment later on that. Let me quickly get through the uncoded caching with the D2D communication. So the network topology is very simple. We have nodes, and we have this very simple protocol for which a receiver is able to communicate in a certain radius R, provided that there is no other transmitter that is active in a radius 1 plus delta times R. Okay? So there's this forbidden safety region around every successful receiver. So this is a Gupta and Kumar model. The other thing that we have to assume in order to make the problem mathematically well posed is to make this asynchronous request. So how do we make asynchronous requests in an information theoretic problem where you have an infinite time horizon? We think of the following. Imagine that the files are made of big packets. And then we say, okay, users, when they make a request, they request a file, but also they request a starting point and a chunk of this packet that starts at random in this file. And then we do the limits in the following order. We first let the number of packets per file go to infinity, and then we let everybody else go to infinity. In this way, the probability that two requests overlap is zero, becomes zero. Okay? And so they are asynchronous by nature. However, since everything is normalized, when we look at the cache size and the library size, is counted in files, not in bits. Everything is normalized by this number of packets per file, so we can still have the same request, meaning that the same file is here and here, although this user will never be able to download the same part of the same file at the same time. So in this way, we can rule out what we call naive multicasting, which is one transmission is good for two people at the same time. Okay? So the rest of the definitions is somehow tedious, but maybe a little bit important. So what is a cache placement? A cache placement is essentially, for this uncoded case, is a bipartite graph that says which files are cached in which users. Right? You have files, users, you have a bipartite graph. And the constraint, you have the user node degree is less than m, means that every user can cache at most m files. Of course, you can put a probability distribution on that. If you do random caching, then you put a probability distribution on these bipartite graphs. And then you can, for example, consider what is called the independent random caching or decentralized scheme, where this probability distribution is a product distribution, meaning that every user picks its m files at random, independently from the others. Now, random request, same idea. You have a probability distribution for a set of requests. A set of requests is a vector with values in the file library. And then, if we say the users have independent requests, it means that the probability distribution of this vector of request is a product distribution. And we assume that this probability is known. Okay? And finally, a transmission policy. This took us a little bit of time to understand, because we have to distinguish between throughput and instantaneous rate. If you do interference avoidance like this, maybe a link is not active all the time. A link is used with a certain probability. But this doesn't mean that the user is in outage. Because if for example, I'm served by an access point here that serves all of you, I'm getting more or less, say, equal fraction of time. I get 1/200 times the peak rate of this link, right? But so my rate is 1/200, because we are 200. The peak rate, my 50 megabits, so I get whatever 100 of kilobit per second on average, and this may be enough to watch your video. So we have to distinguish, the so-called outage probability of the physical layer, which is a link is in outage with probability p, does not mean anything when you transmit. When you transmit, this you are averaging over time. Even if you are not serving a certain chunk or in a certain time slot, your rate is still there, right? So we have to be a bit careful there. So mathematically, we say, well, okay, you have say the set of all possible links that you can activate at the same time. This is an activation schedule is an independent set in these conflict graphs of links that that describes the mutual interference. And then we place a probability distribution on this set of possibilities, meaning that with a certain probability you use this schedule, then this schedule, then this schedule, and then you average over time, and this is the rate you get. So then the problem is, okay, so when do you define an outage? What is an outage here? An outage is when a user demand cannot be satisfied, which doesn't mean that a link gives you zero rate. It means that this gives you zero average rate, but average rate must be average. It must be a conditional average. It must be given the demand and given the placement, the rate is zero. The average rate is zero. Because when you average also over the demands and the placement, then your rate is always positive, right? One time you're lucky and you have the file, one time you are not. So you're like 50%, you're lucky. What does it mean? That you get rate 50% of your rate? No, you get sometimes you don't get the file, sometimes you get the file. And this is the outage we care about. So So we define, the throughput. This is the instantaneous throughput. You just sum over the active links, their capacities. Then we define the number of users in outage are the sum of this indicator function, and this is the average, the conditional average of the throughput per user given demand and placement is equal to 0. And then we just define the probability of outage as the ensemble average over the users and over the statistics of this thing. And when you take average of an indicator function, then finally you have a probability. And in this way, I believe the problem is well defined. So under these conditions, then we can define the minimum average throughput per users and the outage probability. And our problem is to find the pairs TP, where T is this minimum throughput and P is the outage probability, such that TP is achievable. So there is a scheme that gives you that, right? So the problem is also to find the best throughput given P is maximize the minimum average throughput subject to a probability outage constraint. And one can show essentially that you get a profile like that. Points on this line dominate because points in this blue area have worse outage and worse throughput. So they are dominated by this point. There must be a Pareto boundary of this region. And you can show that this region is also makes a convex set. Okay? So at the end, with all these, we come up with a scheme which is very simple. You define clusters, and you say users can communicate within clusters. And then for every cluster, you would like to maximize the probability to find the file in that cluster. And it turns out that this caching distribution has a sort of water-filling flavor. So you cache according to some probability up to a cutoff point, and then the tail of the distribution, you just don't cache. Those are, if a user places a request in that tail, it's an outage. Okay? So once you do that, you can prove a complicated theorem, but all this theorem, all what you care is the first line. The first line says the throughput is a constant times m size of the cache divided by size of the library for a number, a probability of outage, which is some number that we can make, less than 1. If you make it small, then your constant here is going to be small. If you make it large, then this constant, constant in front of the scaling law becomes large. But the important thing is that it is less than 1. So it does not go to 1 when n goes to infinity, meaning that you have a linear fraction of users that can be served. Okay? Now, linear fraction may be 90% or maybe 10%. It depends on, then it is the trade-off that you can optimize. But this is not somehow captured, that scaling laws are coarse measures, okay? So, I will spare comments on the results. Let's say, for example, now I'm going to switch to the other scheme, the scheme that proposed by Madali and Nieser, which is also very elegant and very beautiful. So the scheme works like that. So this is, they pose the problem in a different way. Probably the best thing is to look at this example and then talk about the result. So they assume that to have a network where you have just one transmitter, for example, one base station, serving multicasting information to many users. Common, noiseless, capacitated links. Say the transmitter, say 1 bit per channel use or 1 packet per use. Okay? Everybody gets the same message. So this is the so-called index coding paradigm. Users have caches, and the problem is you have a library. In this case, the library is file ABC. You can split these files into sub-packets, and you can store sub-packets into the caches. Of course, when you pose the problem, you don't impose this. This is the achievability scheme, that you end up storing sub-packets. Okay? You may do something different, but they prove that this is the optimal thing to do. So this means that none of the users has a whole file. This guy, for example, has a little bit of each file. Now, the point is that users make an arbitrary set of demands. So we focus on the worst case. And the worst case is easy to show, is when every user wants something different. So now, without loss of generality, you imagine that the user user 1 wants A, user 2 wants B, user 3 wants C, and none of them is already satisfied because none of them has a whole file. So now, the problem is find a code word which is a network coded, inter-session coded code word. You're mixing packets from different sessions, from different files, that satisfies at once all the demands. And what they call rate is effectively the normalized length of this code word. So here you want to minimize the length, because this is a sort of, you impose to serve everybody, so the probability of outage is 0, and you want to minimize the worst case length. This is, I would say, is a source coding flavor type, right? When you say, for example, Huffman codes, or when you do lossless source coding, your goal is you want to encode the source sequence, so there is no probability of error, and you want to minimize the length. So, of course, the throughput that I was talking about is easily related to the reciprocal of this minimum rate, because the maximum, the min-max rate, mean with respect to the choice of the code, max with respect to the worst-case demands. So, in this case, for example, for this set of demands, because of the way caches have been designed, it turns out that by XORing the missing packets, this guy misses, he has a A12, A13, he misses 823. So, and this guy misses B13, this guy misses C12. So these are XORed together and sent to everybody. Because each one has side information, now everybody can decode the missing information and retrieve the desired file. In this way, you see that the length of the transmission has a transmission of a single sub-packet. So it's 1/3 of a file. So this scheme achieves rates 1/3. Okay? Well, it turns out that you can prove an outer bound based on a cut-set bound. And this 1/3 is optimal. Meets the outer bound with equality. Okay? So this scheme is optimal. And of course, what they have done is generalize this idea where you sub-packetize in a certain way, you store packets according to a certain rule, and then there is a very simple rule of forming these code words, and then they have a general outer bound, and they show that the outer bound, the gap between outer bound and achievability is a fixed multiplicative constant, which they can prove a factor of 12, but in fact, simulations show that it is a factor of 2, most likely. Okay? So it means that this scheme is order optimal, and it is in fact a factor of 2, at most a factor of 2 away from an outer bound. So the formula for the achievability is this. This rate has the following explanation. Well, you want to serve n users. Each user caches a fraction m over the size of the cache over size of the library fraction. So this would be what you would have to transmit in a, let's say, trivial scheme, where you just, for example, use an MDS code, and then you just send individually encoded packets. So it's n times what is missing. Okay? And then there is this magic factor here, that is the multicasting gain factor. This depends on the ratio of the aggregate memory divided by the library. So you see that when this ratio is very large, this kills the throughput, and you get this very nice behavior, which is big M over small m. Okay, so I have 5 minutes. So in these 5 minutes, let me say the following. So in our, the third work I wanted to talk about is where we essentially use this coded multicasting idea together with the D2D network. So now we do not assume to have a node that can communicate to everybody and has all the files. Now we have only peers, and communication is just peer-to-peer. So no node has all the files in the library. Okay? So under these conditions, we can design a scheme that is somehow inspired by the Madali and Nisa scheme, for which every user caches a subset of packets, and then users will exchange coded and multicast, instead of just sending a file in clear to the guy who requested. You just collect some requests of your neighbors and send some multicast packet that is useful for all your neighbors. Okay? So what we can prove is that the scaling, so the rate of the scheme is of this kind. And now when you look at this formula and you look at this formula and you compare them for when essentially this ratio is large, they are almost the same. They differ by very little. And now this is an example, again, for 3 files and 3 users. But now you see there is no common base station that satisfies everybody. In this case, you cache sub-packets in a slightly different way. And now every user will send to the other user, multicast to the other user, a XOR, say, network-coded packet. And you can prove that in this case, since you have essentially 1, 2, 3 transmissions, each one is 1/3, you get an overall rate of 1/2. So this scheme gets 1/2. The other one with a single transmitter would get 1/3, which is better. Okay? But when you compare these in the regime of large, the interesting regime of high content reuse, these 2 rates tend to be indistinguishable. So there is really no loss in having a completely decentralized scheme. However, there is also no gain in having this, let's say, try to cumulate multicasting gain and reuse and spatial reuse. Why is this? So intuitively, well, this is a product of the mathematics. You do the math and you find this. Intuitively, the intuitive explanation is the following. In order to get spatial reuse gain, you want your transmission to be as local as possible. You want to just serve the guy near you without interfering with anybody else, such that the same slot can be reused very densely across space in the network. However, when you send coded information that is simultaneously useful for many users, you want that your coded information is heard by as many users as possible, right? So you have these 2 contrasting goals. On one hand, you want to be local to get reuse gain. And on the other hand, you want to be global in order to have multicasting gain. And these 2 things do not cumulate. In other words, you can cut the networks in subnetworks and then introduce a certain reuse factor, and still the scaling law remains the same. So at the end, it means that when you go to the comparison, there may be a sweet spot. There may be a good trade-off between local and link rate and global in terms of multicasting gain, but this is not seen in the scaling laws. It's seen in the constant that governs the actual rates. So you have to go to a much more refined physical layer models to actually quantify pros and cons on the different schemes. Okay? So I will not go through the converse. Anyway, the idea of the converse is that you build a a compound scenario, because here we are looking at the worst case demands. So it's like every user would request splits into many users requesting all possible files in all possible ways, and then you do cuts separating the users from what they receive and the content of the caches, which is common to all the users, essentially identified by the same index, because those are virtual users. Every user is an index, the user, and a request in this graph. And then, depending on which cut you choose, you find bounds, and then you need a little bit of intuition in finding the right cuts to get the good bounds. Anyway, okay, this is just a simple simulation where you work with Andy Molish, you end up for sure working with channel models, because this is his thing, right? So we said, okay, let's use winner 2 channel models for D2D and with low elevation, this frequency, this path loss, this blocking probability, and everything. And we compare some schemes. I'm not saying that this is the truth. This is the truth according to our simulations. And of course, you change the model, you find different results. What we find is that under our system assumptions, that seems to be compliant to, say, LTE and what is forecast to become LTE D2D. We essentially took Qualcomm Flash Link as a reference for LTE D2D, although nobody knows what LTE D2D will be. And we find that the D2D scheme, this is outage, this is throughput, the D2D scheme dominates all the other schemes that relies only on the simple just transmission from the base station, including the multicasting. And this is because when you transmit from just one base station, you have a lot of users who are in outage because they just don't get a good channel because they are at the fringe of the cell. So if you shoot for the worst case rate, then of course you are essentially constrained to the edge users. Of course, if you come up with some kind of multicasting scheme that use like multi-point multicasting, so you multicast the same, like a single frequency network, for example, where you multicast the same thing from many base stations simultaneously, then you erase this edge effect, and then you reverse these results. So I'm not like betting on this result. I'm just saying that in the case of a single cell with a certain path loss and some realistic channel models, the D2D schemes seems to be more attractive, provided of course that we have a D2D efficient D2D scheme that we don't right now. Okay, so the conclusion is that caching at the wireless edge is able to exploit asynchronous content reuse. By doing numbers we see easily, we can get this factor 100 just because there are, you just multiply the number of links by a factor 100. You get to a very, very dense packing of the communication, especially in the D2D case. We talked about the D2D option and the multicast option and maybe something in between. There may be some optimization, some system optimization to do there. There is an interesting good news for LTE operators is you can use your infrastructure to refill caches at off-peak times, so low-cost bits. You don't interfere with users at peak times that want to for their call and their text messages to go through. And finally, the really kind of selling point here is that it seems, of course, according to these scaling laws, that we can turn silicon into bandwidth. You double your memory, or you improve your memory by your onboard memory by, say, a factor of 10, you get 10 times more throughput. And this is the end. Thank you very much.
For this caching ideas to work, it seems like you need a lot of near collocated users.
Yes.
Who are interested in the same kind of subset of files, let's say.
Yes.
But in practice, as far as I know, for the content, let's say it's the CDNs, right? They know, for instance, Netflix, which knows that which users are interested in which files. But the service provider knows the locations of the users. So how actually this information will be, let's say from a
That's a good question. Is actually there are a lot of questions that arise from how a business like that would work. Questions like what you just asked, questions about copyright, people don't trusting to store files into user devices, etc., etc., etc. Content providers that don't trust the operators don't trust the users, etc. All these things. And it is all true, all very, very valid. For your specific question, I think that that's true until the service providers, say the wireless operators, are essentially dumb pipes, and the money is made by the application layer people like Netflix, iTunes, Amazon Prime, then there is not much hope. However, there is a movement, and I want to stress the fact that this whole big project of video-aware wireless networks was initiated when I was at USC. together with some other people from TU Austin and San Diego, and UC San Diego, and it was funded by Intel, Verizon, and Cisco. So Verizon is a wireless operator, and they essentially are tired to be the dump pipe. So they want to make money out of their hertz. So now they have, there are two ways to go, right? There's way number one, wireless operators start offering video streaming services on their networks, and therefore they can be as smart as they want, right? The second option is that they start charging more the application layer people. Like, for example, Netflix is already, when there was a ruling of FCC that essentially just killed the principle of network neutrality, which means that if, say, Verizon may decide to charge Netflix for more because they say, well, these are highly valued bits, and we want a chunk of these revenues. Okay, so in this case, what Netflix would do? Netflix, if I was Netflix, I would cut a deal with a very silly operator that have, for example, I hope I do not offend anybody. We are in Europe, okay, but let's say, for example, Nextel. Nextel in the US has been struggling forever. The only reason why they're still in business is that because they own some spectrum. Okay? Otherwise, they have no customer in comparison to AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile. So let's say I strike a deal with Nextel. They have some tower, some spectrum, and say, okay, you don't have customers, but you can use your tower to fill in caches. And we, Netflix or Amazon Prime, we provide the software, the apps, some security to isolate part of the memory of the device. It's already done today. There is I think Google, Android offers like a securized segment of your memory that cannot be accessed when you have, like, say, company secrets, and then you have your email, your personal emails to your mistress. I shouldn't say that. In another part of the memory, so these things do not mix, right? So all these things can be done, right? There is no technology limitation in doing this. It is more a business strategy to implement them. But I think that this is really low level. There may be some interesting security problem, or some other type of problems that should be solved. But conceptually, I think that there is not big stumbling blocks. To me, the biggest stumbling blocks here is the second question you ask is how do we know that many users in the same place want the same stuff, right? And this is the problem of predicting the content distribution in space and time. And this is I think is a very interesting problem. I think that there are no good solutions so far. I think that machine learning should be heavily involved because we are faced with an enormous amount of data that are collected. We should model the user behavior, which is a very difficult thing to do for engineers who are able to model, wireless channels and physical processes. But when you have to model human behavior, maybe we should work with somebody else who, I don't know, human-machine interfaces, psychologists, I don't know. But there should be, there is an enormous amount of intelligence and effort by companies like Google, Facebook, and all the big internet companies in predicting the next click, right? Predicting the human behavior in the space of like a millisecond. Now here, probably things are not so difficult if you think. We have to predict a local ensemble behavior. When you average over the whole world, these distributions have an enormous fat tail. Because of course, over the whole world, there is no real concentration. There are many different people interested in different things. But if you average over kind of localized, for example, imagine like a student cafeteria. At noon, you see very specific pattern. These guys probably are going to download the same viral video of the week over and over and over again, right? And etc. So in this way, I think that this distribution can become very picky. But of course, this is an intuition. I have no evidence. Maybe I'm totally wrong. And this would be an interesting study to do. But of course, all these results, let's say, the results on the arbitrary demands, of course, work. There is worst case. They do not require anything. But they require that the library is finite. If you have like a very long tail, infinite library, then you need some form of concentration. Otherwise, clearly, we are never in this reuse regime that is interesting. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I have another question on the practical side. It's almost a continuation of the same discussion. Nowadays, if you look at the commercially available smartphones, I think the smartest of these phones can barely serve me for 1 day before I have to recharge it.
Right.
Now, given that I can predict all these things, and I have all these collaboration between the users to do that, how does that affect the lifetime of the battery? How much?
Right.
How feasible is it?
So this is also a very interesting problem. I do not have an answer, but this calls for some study. I think, actually, now that you say that, I should just phone to my students immediately. This is what I'm going to do, because actually that's a very interesting problem. So I think that we have two conflicting trends here. The first trend is, of course, that you are going to, of course, you have to compare with the baseline solution. The baseline solution is that you would still consume video, but you will get it from, say, the Wi-Fi or the LTE tower, right? Now, is this, say, D2D high density going to be more efficient or less efficient than that? Because, of course, if I compare with somebody that does not watch anything, clearly, right, you only make very short phone calls, then your battery will last longer. So let me say this. You have two conflicting issues here. Issue number one, you're going to use more battery because you're going to serve also other people requests. At the same time, you serve them at a very short range because the assumption here is that you have high density. So now you are going to use more airtime but less energy because you are communicating at a short range. What is better? I don't know. It's a good question. I don't think that it's a trivial answer. Probably maybe there is a sweet spot. Maybe when you put the energy and the battery life also into the picture and you put a constraint there, maybe you get different scaling laws where you also have another dimension. This could be.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. So for the schemes that you have presented, the inner bounds and the outer bounds scale in the same way? It's just a constant factor?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
For all of them?
For all of them. Yes.
Okay, for sure there are much more comments. So there are no further questions. Let me give you.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. At the same time, so the only alternative is to make networks cheaper to operate. Dramatically cheaper. The cost per bit must go dramatically down. Okay, so what is the standard answer to this problem? Is denser spatial reuse. Denser spatial reuse means somehow make the infrastructure more and more dense. This is a nice picture that I took from a presentation of Jeff Andrews that shows that if you look at the 50s to today and look at the contribution that more spectrum, going to better like frequency division, allocation, all this dynamic spectrum, blah, 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 cognitive radio, I have total respect for those problems, but, and of course, all the standardizations, successive generations going from GMSK to 8PSK to OFDM, big QAM constellations, all MIMO. I mean, all this stuff that we love so much counts for like a very small factor. And just making the infrastructure denser counts for like orders of magnitude more. And this is very easy to understand, right? You shrink by a certain factor the distance between base stations, and then your density goes up quadratically with this factor, and you just reuse the spectrum more and more. So it's very easy. You take a factor of 10 in distance, you get a factor of 100 in spectral efficiency, area spectral efficiency. Okay? So we also know that there is a fundamental law on transport capacity, which means that if we have to move a bit by a long distance, well, this is difficult. We have like a fundamental bound that says that we cannot fit too many links. The capacity per link when the distance...
Good afternoon. I'm Enzo Mozano, and I've been asked by the organizers to introduce Giuseppe Caire, the next keynote speaker. Thank you very much for this honor. So I have known Giuseppe for many years, and when I think about him, the term that comes to mind is wideband, or maybe even ultra-wideband, because he has a broader command and understanding of wireless communications than anybody I know. So he could be discussing some deep information theoretic aspect with somebody involving nitty-gritty mutual information, and then just turn around and start talking with somebody else about, say, synchronization or any other practical issue. And recently even about standardization and the business value of specific techniques. And of course, he can discuss anything else in between these extremes, say channel estimation, power control, coding, interference management, MIMO, massive MIMO, and you name it. So on all these problems, he's made important, sometimes fundamental contributions. So he has an amazing bandwidth. And for those of us who live and work in Europe, there's now a reason to celebrate, because after a few years of exile in the US, he's back amongst us, settled in Germany as of a few months ago. So he's an asset that we're going to have. And so let me say, Giuseppe, on behalf of European wireless research community, that it's good to have you back. And today he's going to talk about an idea that's getting momentum, and that's, in a sense, a very good complement to what Shlomo covered this morning. So Shlomo told us about the benefits of centralizing the baseband processing at the core. And Giuseppe is going to sing the virtues of keeping the data stored at the edges. So these are two powerful ideas, perhaps even conflicting ideas, I don't know. Maybe you'll touch on that. But definitely
is essentially of the size, of the linear size of the network, goes to 0 as one of the number of 1 over square root of the number of connections. But, of course, if we let the distance to go also to shrink as 1 over square root of n, which means essentially we keep increasing the density and therefore make the distance between the content and the destination shorter, we can keep this per link throughput constant. Okay? So that's the idea. We need to bring the content closer to the users, which means, it would be nice to have a little base station every 10 meters connected to a fantastic fiber optical backhaul that somehow, as soon as you browse the internet and you request some content, is already at a few meters from you. You get it from a very high frequency link with a large bandwidth and do not interfere with anybody else, and everybody's happy. So what is the problem with this solution? Of course, the problem is backhaul. Backhaul bottleneck, as we learned from Shlomo's talk this morning. Well, the backhaul can be improved. The techniques, very sophisticated compression, front haul. Now, what is backhaul? What is front haul? Here, I'm more concerned about backhaul, really moving the data around. Front haul is more like moving the signals from the antenna heads to the central processor, but somehow, say, at a high level, they somehow look the same. You have a very high rate fiber optical network, and you want to connect all these little base stations or antenna heads as much as you can. And of course, this costs a lot of money. There are some countries that have wired, and you have fiber optics sockets in every apartment, and then they have no problems. But go to the United States.
Two powerful ideas and disruptive, which is what ones like to see in a keynote presentation. So let's hear about it. Please help me welcome Professor Giuseppe Caire.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thanks to the organizers for inviting me here. It's great. This is the typical example of a good trade-off between a very attractive place to be, so people come, and you know, maybe not too attractive, so people stay in the session. I see. That's fantastic. About the best. Okay, so this is a very kind of high-level overview of a topic that, as Angel just said, is really gaining momentum. And the idea is that you know, people realize that sometimes layering and letting computer science software people deal with the application layer as if the physical layer and the network layer didn't exist, and letting, you know, the standard people go down to the air interface and somehow do not take into account that data have very different natures and that could be exploited is not the best thing to do. So these cross-layer design ideas have been going on for a long time, but here we are trying to take a different approach. You can see, in a very broad sense, this as a sort of cross-layer design, because of course, you know, content stays at the application layer, and transmission and spectral efficiency stays at the physical layer, and there is a lot of things in between. But this is more on the network architecture. So looking at a different network architecture for a certain type of killer applications that, as we will see, have a big impact in this sort of spectrum crunch that people are saying we are experiencing. And at the same time, it's also very interesting to see that this type of approach gives origin to a new set of problems that are a little bit different from the classical setting of information theoretic problems. So there is also some interesting theory to develop. And I should mention that this is in particular joint work with my students and colleagues at USC, and of course with Dr. Antonia Tulino and Jaime Yorca at Bell Labs. Okay, so this picture is what keeps us in business, because it's the prediction that essentially data demands keep growing almost at an exponential rate. And in particular, as you can see, mobile video and mobile web data plays a big role. Altogether, count for like over 85% of the wireless traffic today. At the same time, this is also a picture that is really frightening for wireless operators, is that, well, at the introduction of flat rate data plans, revenues keep being leveled and grow very slowly, while data demand goes very quickly. So essentially, people do not know how to make money anymore out of wireless, because you cannot keep charging by the byte, because we keep now consuming more and more and more gigabytes every month. So this would be totally infeasible.